Good morning. Welcome back to Pumpkins and Politics with Chad George, a weekly podcast in which we talk about politics, the world, everything in between. I hope you're all doing well on this Monday morning. This is Thursday as I'm recording this, getting ready for the podcast. This is my opportunity to give you a little bit behind the scenes look at how we produce this podcast, how we bring this to you, and I hope you enjoy it. And then you can find this on YouTube every Monday afternoon around 2 o'clock. And please give us a thumbs up, share us, go over Thursday, listen to the podcast. But this is just a little bit of behind the scenes. This week we're going to talk about Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., about the possibility of them becoming possible states, where we go from here, what Congress has to do, and what the residents of those territories and cities think. And I'm anxious to see what you think as well. And our influential person this week comes from Arkansas. We'll talk a little bit about him as well, and I'm anxious to see if any of you know who it may be, but he's an author and a lawyer, which doesn't really narrow it down any, but I'm anxious to see what you think. So we're going to begin here in a few moments, so sit back and enjoy, and I'll talk to you in the flip. Welcome back to Pumpkins and Politics with Chad George. I hope everyone had a good week. This is a weekly podcast where we come together to have an honest, candid, and respectful conversation about politics, the world, and everything in between. I would love to hear from you. If you have questions to ask, send me an email to pumpkinsandpolitics@gmail.com with your questions, and please tell me where you're from. I'll answer as many questions as I can at the end of each episode. All right, let's get into the patch. Today we're talking a little bit about Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., about the possibility of them becoming states, the 51st and the 52nd state. The question that I have for all of you is, could Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. become the 51st and 52nd states? The last two states that have been added to the Union was Alaska, January 3rd, 1959, and Hawaii on August 21st, 1959. Now, each of these possible states, whether it's Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., or just Washington, D.C., or just Puerto Rico, each of these have a possibility. It's a very slim possibility, but it is a possibility nonetheless. We're taking a look at the possibility, in order to get it done, is that you would have to have some form of filibuster reform in the Senate. If they can do that, which limits it from being 60 votes to being just a simple majority, it could make Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. states. They would have to carry every Democrat senator, including Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, as well as Kristen Sinema from the state of Nevada, or the state of Arizona, and each are against the filibuster reform. So even though there's a glimmer of hope that Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico could be states, without that filibuster reform, it's not going to happen, because Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema both have said that they would not be for filibuster reform, and there's just not 60 senators out there that would support it. Now, the push to recognize Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico as states with equal representation in Congress is decades old. Last Congress, a bill passed the House, but was killed upon arrival in the Senate. Congressman Darren Soto, a Democrat from Florida, introduced legislation in March for Puerto Rico statehood. Residents of the United States territory are U.S. citizens. They cannot vote for president other than in primaries, and are not represented by a voting member of the Congress. So this is how it works, and it's very similar to how Washington, D.C. operates. First of all, Washington, D.C. elects a delegate. The delegate can serve on committees. They can vote within committees. They can vote if the House goes into a committee of the whole, but they cannot vote when they are sitting in session on legislation or amendments, even if it's to benefit their city or their territory. In Puerto Rico, it's exactly the same pretty much. They're called delegates as well, or commissioners, some are called. They can serve on committees, they can propose legislation, they can vote on amendments within a committee structure, they can chair committees and subcommittees, but they cannot vote when the House sits as a House of Representatives, cannot vote on bills or amendments, even if it's beneficial to their home territories or city. So that is a big change that could happen if we wind up getting Puerto Rico or Washington, D.C. as states. In Washington, D.C., it is governed by a city council. It is represented by a non-voting delegate in the House of Representatives. It is subject to congressional oversight, and it has a mayor. Now, how Washington, D.C. operates, which is different than Puerto Rico. Washington, D.C. has a city council, they have a mayor, but everything is controlled by the Congress. The Congress sets the budget. The Congress does any kind of laws or statutes that affect Washington, D.C. It's solely handled by the Congress. It has forever. Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is the delegate from Washington, D.C., introduced H.R. 51. And what H.R. 51 does is it provides for the district's admission into the Union on equal footing with other states. So they would get a representative in Congress, a voting representative in Congress, and they would also get 2 United States senators. And they would, of course, get a governor and all of that. They would admit D.C. as the state of Washington Douglas Commonwealth. So it would be named after Frederick Douglass. It would give residents of the district equal representation. Again, 1 voting representative in the House, 2 United States senators. It ensures the Congress would never again interfere in D.C.'s local laws and governing. It would cordon off the White House, the Capitol, and the National Mall to remain under federal control as the seat of the United States government. So, D.C. would not be responsible for the upkeep of the White House or the Capitol or the National Mall or any other national monument. They would still be required and responsible for them to take care of providing security, but they would not have to financially support those institutions, provide lawn care and all that other stuff that usually goes in with taking care of buildings. Now, advocates for Washington, D.C. statehood say it's a civil rights issue. The district has a population of more than 700,000 people. It's larger than the population of Wyoming and Vermont. And those 2 senators, or those 2 states, have voting member in the House and 2 United States senators. The District of Columbia has not any voting representation in the United States Congress. Advocates also point out that Washington, D.C. pays more in federal taxes than 21 other states, more per capita than any state. D.C. is also diverse, 46% black, majority are non-white. If admitted, it would be the first state with a plurality of black population, which would be impressive, and we should embrace that as Americans. We should embrace that as Americans. So if you look at the statistics of Washington, D.C., if it becomes a state, it would rank 49th by population, ahead of Vermont and Wyoming. It would be the 51st by area, be first by GDP per capita, it would be first by median income, it would be 34th by total GDP, it would be the first state to be admitted in 62 years, and it would be ranked first in educational attainment. 59% of the residents have a bachelor's degree. 34% have advanced degrees. The first in population density, 11,011 people per square mile, 9 times more dense than New Jersey, and 11,000 times denser than Alaska, which has 1 person per square mile. So the benefits of being a state is there when it comes to Washington, D.C. And we're going to get to some of the arguments against it coming up. But I believe that we can see where it would be beneficial to them. If you look at what George Mason wrote in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, this is what he wrote. The elections of members to serve as representatives of the people in assembly ought to be free, and that all men having sufficient evidence of permanent common interest with and attachment to the community have the right of suffrage and cannot be taxed or deprived of their property for public uses without their own consent or that of their representatives so elected, nor bound by any law to which they have not, in like manner, asserted or assented for the public good. And that all power of suspending laws or the execution of laws by any authority without consent of the representative of the people is injurious to their rights and ought not to be exercised. The whole argument that comes down to Washington, D.C. statehood, I think more so than Puerto Rico. You know, Puerto Rico is different in a way because of how their governmental structure is, which we'll talk about. Washington, D.C., their license plate says no taxation without representation. It is so true when it comes to Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has no representation. Yeah, they send a delegate that's elected every 2 years, but they really aren't people that have the rights that every other citizen has. They're controlled solely by the federal government, so when the federal government says no, D.C. doesn't get it, no matter how hard their representatives and their mayor and their city council advocates for it. The Congress has exclusive jurisdiction over Washington, D.C. All must be approved by the Congress. Local regulations and the budget. So you have a bunch of bureaucrats who do not live in Washington, D.C., controlling the budget of those 700,000 people that live in the district. And we call that fair. That's not fair at all. That is not fair at all. All they're asking for D.C. to become a state is that they have equal representation, that they can control their own budget. They can control their own laws and statutes and regulations and ordinance. Them, not anyone else, not a bunch of elected bureaucrats from other states, them. The idea of DC statehood is growing in popularity nationwide. In March, a poll was conducted by Data for Progress and the Progressive Coalition Democracy for All 2021 action. 54% of likely voters think DC should be a state. Many say the January 6th attack on the Capitol is a big issue. What happened on January 6th when it comes to the Capitol building is that the mayor has no authority to call out her National Guard. It's really not her National Guard. DC has a guard. The mayor cannot unilaterally call out the guard. If you live in a state, if we lived in Maryland, you lived in Virginia, you lived in Delaware, Pennsylvania, any state, the governor automatically can call out the National Guard to keep order. But in DC, that can't happen. In order for that to happen, the guard needs to be called out by the President of the United States under the direction of the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Army. That's what did not happen, if you recall, back in January 6th. Back in January 6th, you had a riot that was out of control. The mayor tried to call the Secretary of Defense, tried to call the White House. There was no answer. The Speaker tried to call the White House to ask for help? Nothing. The vice president was the one that wound up getting a hold of the Secretary of Defense and ordering protection. As mayor of D.C., the mayor could have done that if she had the authority, but she didn't have the authority. She called out what she controls, which is the D.C. Metropolitan Police. She called them out. They were already on high alert. Many were already at the Capitol building, but she could call out more under her authority as mayor. So D.C. is saying, if we would have had a mayor that controlled the National Guard, the riot may not have gotten so far out of control as it did. So that's something to think about as we're going forward and maybe debate. And we're going to talk about other options that people are looking at when it comes to D.C. Some have been arguments for decades. Some make absolutely no sense. But we're going to take a look at those later on in the podcast. So if we turn to Puerto Rico now, Puerto Rico is a smidge different. Puerto Rico is counted as a U.S. territory. They have a governor, they have a House of Representatives, they have a Senate, they have a Supreme Court, they have a court structure. Residents are United States citizens. They are not granted a voting representative in the Congress and cannot vote for President of the United States, but they can vote in a primary. So there's Democratic and Republican primaries, but they can elect the nominee, help elect the nominee of the party for president, but they cannot actually vote in November in the general election. The matter of statehood in Puerto Rico has been considered 3 times between 1967 and 1998, with a majority choosing to retain Puerto Rico's Commonwealth or self-governing state without an independent existence. Now, Congressman DeSoto from Florida introduced H.R. 1522, which is a little similar to the bill that was proposed by Delegate Holmes Norton. After a majority of Puerto Rican voters responded yes in the November 2020 referendum, the ballot language was simple: statehood, yes or no. Couldn't get more simple than that. Some of the other referendums through the years could be cited as being kind of confusing. They used more legalistic language. There wasn't a clear notion as to what was happening or what they were actually voting for. So it turned off some people who just didn't understand the ballot language. This one was simple, just yes or no. 52.52% voted yes. They wanted statehood. We need to hear the pleas of equality from our fellow Americans in Puerto Rico. We must recognize that a majority has asked the Congress of the United States for statehood, and they must respect it. I don't believe enough people in Congress respect it. We right now have a Congress that's dysfunctional. We've talked about it on this podcast a lot since we aired on April 15th. We're going to continue talking about it as long as the dysfunction is still there. The dysfunction in Congress has made it impossible to govern. It just has made it impossible. There's just no way to govern anymore in Washington, D.C. You have legislators that go up there not to do legislating, not to do the people's business, but to do their own. We're seeing it, again, going off a little bit on a tangent, but we're seeing what is happening right now with Liz Cheney, who is probably going to be deposed of her leadership position because she's telling the truth about Donald Trump and the riots. And Republicans don't like to hear the truth. Here you have 52.52% of Puerto Ricans who are American citizens that only want the same rights as every other American citizen wants. They want to be able to vote and have equal representation in the United States Congress. That's all they want. So the argument for the renewed interest in Puerto Rican statehood is basic. First, economic recession. Puerto Rico has been drastically hit with the recession, mainly because of the natural disasters. You had a president, instead of going there and helping the people of Puerto Rico, He went and threw paper towels at them. That solved nothing. That solved nothing other than make himself look like a jackass. So you have that. You have, of course, the natural disasters, and you have the coronavirus pandemic that hit Puerto Rico exponentially. All of these, recession, natural disaster, pandemic, has all drastically hurt Puerto Rico. And because they aren't considered a state, they are not getting the same financial outlays that we do, living here in Pennsylvania, or living in Maryland, or living in New Jersey, or California, or Texas. All get a lot of federal funding because they're states to try to help them. Puerto Rico doesn't. They have to fend for everything they have with very little help or assistance from the federal government. So some are asking, well, how exactly did we get to where we are with Puerto Rico? And Puerto Rico has more of a diverse history and background than Washington, D.C. does. Washington, D.C. has existed as part of the United States since its beginning. D.C., some will argue, was never meant to be made a state. It was supposed to be the seat of government. Puerto Rico was their own individual country. So a little history of Puerto Rico and how the United States got this island territory. The United States acquired Puerto Rico in 1898 under the presidency of William McKinley. It followed the Spanish-American War, and it's made Puerto Rico the oldest colony in the modern world. The population of Puerto Rico is 3.2 million people, around half the average state population, higher than that of 20 U.S. states. And some of the options for the future of Puerto Rico is keeping it at the future status, which is it would be a U.S. territory, no voting representation in Congress, just keeping the status quo. Becoming a fully independent territory, being they would get no help from the federal government, they would be totally independent, they'd be their own country. Or becoming a freely associated state. They'd be 51 or 52. They have held 6 referendums on the topic. There were non-binding, these referendums were non-binding, so in other words, you couldn't hold the federal government, you couldn't hold anyone accountable for it. And the power to grant statehood solely lies with the Congress. That's why it's not binding. Because if you would pass a binding resolution, a referendum, so let's say voters would come on, they would say, we vote for statehood, they can't tell Congress to vote for, to admit them. Add us 51 or 52 on that flag there. No, that's not how it operates. They can vote on a referendum, it would report back to the Congress, but the Congress doesn't act. So if the Congress doesn't act, it doesn't come to fruition. So it's non-binding in that aspect, that the Congress controls what happens. And right now there's not a political movement, or I shouldn't say right now. In the past, there's not been a political movement to make Puerto Rico a state. That's changing now. Now, whether Congress hears it, that's another matter. But at this point, right now, Congress isn't hearing it, even though the people are speaking. So let's take a look at the benefits of statehood for Puerto Rico, which would be the same pretty much as DC, just a little different because Puerto Rico is different. The largest U.S. territory in population, geographic area, similar to Connecticut with respect to population size and geographic area. It would be able to vote for president in a general election. It would have equal representation in the Congress, which would be a House member as well as 2 senators. It'd have increased disability benefits. It would have increased Medicaid funding, and it would have higher federal minimum wage. So those benefits would play largely in Puerto Rico, which is financially hurting right now. If you take out just the equal representation, being able to vote in a general election, just take a look at disability benefits, Medicaid funding, and the minimum wage, among a host of other things. I didn't even say the highway trust fund, any of that stuff that would give them more money Right now, they pay into a lot of this, and they only get a fraction out. They don't get very much out of it. It would make them equal to a state. So if a state of that comparable size gets 15% more funding in Medicaid, then Puerto Rico now would get 15% or 18% or 20%. Disability benefits. We know what falls under Medicaid. We know what disabled people are permitted to get under the laws in states. 50 states all have various rules and regulations that are approved by the federal government. And then they get X amount of dollars. There's a formula, and that would be X amount of dollars that state would get. Now Puerto Rico would be able to get those funds. If they pay into it, they can get it. Medicaid would help Puerto Ricans out a great deal. Poverty in Puerto Rico is growing. Homelessness is growing because of the natural disasters and the financial woes, the economic recession. So you have that. You have parts of Puerto Rico that still has not bounced back from the last hurricane, where Donald Trump threw paper towels at the people because that helped so much. Now, those that say, I believe in giving them representation, but I don't believe in giving them statehood. There's some that believe that when it comes to Puerto Rico. So here are some proposals to seek to give Puerto Rico representation but no statehood. It would be giving it its apportioned representatives in the state or in the House and the Senate, so they would get their one representative or their two representative in. If they're comparable to Connecticut, Connecticut has, I believe, 2 representatives, maybe 3. They would get that many. And 2 senators in the United States Senate. But then they would not get the 51st star. So they would get the voting. People could vote. But they would not get the 51st star. Now, I don't know if that's big. Maybe not. Maybe if you get the representation and maybe you get the additional funding, maybe it's not that big to deal with. But I believe it would be. I don't see how you have, Congress going up from its current numbers up 2 in the Senate or maybe 4 in the Senate and not add a star. I mean, that's what represents you as a state. Right now they don't get any of that as a territory. So that's something that I think will be debated. It will be debated among members of Congress going forward in the next couple of months as these bills go through the legislative process, if they go anywhere. I think, again, they'll pass the House. The Senate was supposed to take up the bill. I don't think they have yet. They're supposed to. I don't believe it's going to go far. Not under the current rules. But that's one way, thing that they're looking at when it comes to Puerto Rico. Everyone knows that the current territorial status of Puerto Rico will not last forever. People in Puerto Rico now want something done. They're younger generation now, and the older people are okay to sit back and be a territory because they've lived with it all their life. But now you have some of the young people who now have dreams and aspirations. They want to stay in Puerto Rico, but they want to be a state. They want to be equal. You have a lot of Puerto Ricans who love Puerto Rico that come to the United States just to get the benefits that come with living in the United States, living in the 48, living statewide. Puerto Rico's opposition to the status quo means that the island's entire governmental structure is subject to change. So it would change, somewhat. I don't know if it would change all that much, but there would have to be some because they can govern a little bit like they want. Their government may have to change a little. And no one knows what's going to happen. I don't believe anyone knows what's going to happen with Puerto Rico or Washington, D.C., but for sure Puerto Rico. Again, we've debated Puerto Rican statehood many times throughout the years. The uncertainty definitely discourages the businesses from establishing themselves and it hinders economic growth. If you don't have certainty, if you don't know exactly how the government is going to wind up being formed, you don't know what changes or what additions or what's going to be taken away, if this becomes a state or if it becomes independent, then you have a lot of businesses that aren't going to do it. A lot of American businesses that are stationed in the United States, are stationed within the states. If they do not want to, they may want to go to Puerto Rico. They may say, I want to open up a J.C. Penney or a Walmart or whatever in Puerto Rico to take advantage of some of the tax structure of Puerto Rico. If they don't know what's going to happen, let's say that they wind up becoming independent, their own country, then they're not going to have maybe some of the protections that U.S. taxes or U.S. business structure gives to them. But if they become a state, then you're going to have a lot more governmental protections that you wouldn't have otherwise. And of course, if they stay what they are today, just the status quo, nothing changes, and it's not going to be competitive for businesses to move in. So if you have the lack of business wanting to come in or stay in Puerto Rico, then you're going to have less economic growth. The island is in dire need of new businesses. So many were destroyed by the hurricanes, some left and never came back. So they need business to come over and invest in their future in order to repair what's broken. For sure, if the federal government is not giving them the money that they need or they deserve. But if businesses are willing to come over, they're willing to put down a foundation in Puerto Rico, it will provide employment opportunities, and it'll definitely reinvigorate an economy that is just wrecked. It is a wrecked economy in Puerto Rico, no fault of their own. No fault of their own. You just had a previous administration that totally ignored Puerto Ricans, totally just eviscerated them over there. They didn't get a lot of the financial help they needed to rebuild from the hurricanes. And if you don't have a president who is willing to invest in their people, even though they don't live here in the state, they are still American citizens. They still are entitled to the benefits of being an American. And throwing paper towels or toilet paper or trying to connect people while you're wearing a designer suit and high heels, it isn't going to work. So let's get businesses over there to help give good paying jobs. Let's make it a state if it gives them a higher minimum wage, if it gives them more disability funding or more Medicaid funding, more highway investment. The support of Puerto Rican statehood has been strong throughout the years. In every platform since 1940, Puerto Rican statehood has been talked about in a presidential platform plank. In 1940, Democratic Party platforms, Puerto Rican statehood was in there. In 1976, President Gerald Ford proposed statehood as part of his re-election bid. Again, it was put in the Republican platform as a plank. President Ronald Reagan favored statehood for Puerto Rico. President George H.W. Bush raised statehood in his first State of the Union address to the joint session of Congress in 1989. He issued a memorandum on November 30th, 1992 to heads of executive agencies and departments establishing the current administrative relationship between the federal government and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. His memorandum directs all federal agencies, departments, and officials to treat Puerto Rico administratively as if it were a state, insofar as doing so would not disrupt federal programs and operations. That was George H.W. Bush. President Bill Clinton signed an executive order on December 23, 2000, establishing the President's Task Force on Puerto Rico's states and the rules for its membership. President George W. Bush amended the executive order of President Bill Clinton in December of 2003 to meet every 2 years. And the Democratic Party platforms in 2008, 2012, and 2020 all included Puerto Rican statehood, as well as Republican Party platforms in 2008, 2012, 2016, and 2020. So both political parties have expressed statehood for Puerto Ricans. But yet here we are in 2020, from 1940 to 2020, and Puerto Rico still is in the same status quo that they have been since they became a United States territory in 1898. How absurd and weird is that? The people of Puerto Rico deserve self-determination on the issue of status. It is difficult to comprehend how citizens of our country who are living in Puerto Rico are permitted to serve in the armed forces, yet they are not permitted to vote for their commander-in-chief. Oh, absolutely. You can go to war. Puerto Ricans served in World War II. They served in Korea. They served in Vietnam. They served in the Gulf War. They served in Afghanistan and Iraq. They died. They shed their blood. They were wounded. But they cannot vote for the president that sends them to those wars where they got wounded or killed or served multiple tours. That is not right. And how Congress doesn't see it, how they're blinded by their political ambitions and their political hatred for each other, has left these American citizens, Puerto Ricans who are American citizens, to fend for themselves and to try to get out of financial troubles and economic recessions and pandemics all by themselves with very little help or no help from their federal government. Donald Trump, I bet, in doing research for this, I did not see where this commission that President Clinton formed, that Bush ordered to meet every 2 years. I do not see where it met any time during the Trump administration. It met during President Obama's administration, but it did not meet under President Trump. In fact, 2012 was the last record of a meeting of this task force that I could find. It didn't even meet the last couple of years of the Obama administration, but at least they met. At least their voices were hopefully heard. How do we just close our mind to the suffering of other Americans who just want equal representation, to have equal footing with every other state? So we switch from Puerto Rico back to Washington, D.C. The push for the District of Columbia for becoming a state has really been a lone fight. There's not too many people that are pounding the pavement. There's not a whole host of lobbying and lobbyists that are coming to members of Congress, but one is. Former Connecticut Democrat Senator and Independent Senator Joe Lieberman has been walking the halls of Congress trying to get undecided senators to come over and vote for statehood. Joe Lieberman, who I've had many disagreements with, Joe Lieberman who served as chairman of the Governmental Affairs and Homeland Security committee, it's one committee, who oversees Washington, D.C. He tried to push it several times being chairman of that committee. I remember back in the 90s when John Glenn was chairman of the Committee of Governmental Affairs. He tried to do it. So many people have tried to do it, but Joe Lieberman really took the task. I mean, he really hit the pavement when he was a senator and chairman of that committee and ranking member of that committee with Senator Susan Collins to really make it a priority that Washington, D.C. becomes a state. As I say, tried to push it through several times as a United States Senator. But if you turn to nut job Lindsey Graham, who is a complete nut job, I totally am done with Lindsey Graham. I don't believe he has one iota of sincerity in his whole body. Senator Lindsey Graham, who is friends with former Senator Joe Lieberman, said that even though he's friends with Joe Lieberman, it has zero chance of swaying his vote. Of course it won't. Lindsey Graham doesn't stand for a thing other than being reelected. That's the only thing that that man stands for. And that's why he's a nut job. That's why he's a nut job. Along with Senator Lindsey Graham, there are several other senators and congresspeople that are totally against giving statehood to both Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. I want to take a look first before I get into some of what they're talking about. I want to get into what some of the arguments that have been used against the arguments for D.C. because there's far more arguments against D.C. becoming a state than it is for Puerto Rico. One is national capital should not be an independent, should be independent from a state control. Now, James Madison argued in Federalist number 43, if you want to go historical, that the national capital needed to be distinct from the states in order to provide for its own maintenance and safety. He wrote, quote, "A dependence of the members of the general government on the state, comprehending the seat of the government for protection in the exercise of their duty, might bring on the national councils an imputation of awe or influence equally dishonorable to the government and dissatisfactory to the other members of the Confederacy," unquote. Some are saying a shrunken capital would give the president 3 electoral votes. Washington, D.C. already has 1 electoral vote. But again, wacko ideas. So along with Lindsey Graham saying no to Washington, D.C. statehood, and he's going to say no to any statehood, whether it's Washington, D.C. statehood or whether it's Puerto Rican statehood, other than South Carolina. South Carolina is a state, and they get all the rights and privileges that a state does. But he's denying the right of other taxpayers, other American citizens, to get the same representation for them as people in South Carolina have for themselves. But that's okay, according to Lindsey Graham. Let's talk about another nut job, the House Minority Whip, Congressman Steve Scalise. He made a racist case against D.C. statehood. The District of Columbia spent years struggling to get out from under the thumb of Congress and achieve some measure of political autonomy for its residents. Whip Scalise circulated a memo to House Republicans. On the surface, Whip Scalise is following the usual pattern of anti-statehood arguments. It consists of devising some distinction between D.C. and other small states. Either real, D.C. can't be a state because it lacks a mind, or imagined, D.C. supposedly lacks a car dealership. Do you know how stupid that sounds? I mean, Congressman Scalise, do you know how stupid that sounds? Oh, you can't be a state because you don't have a mind. Oh, you can't be a state because it lacks a car dealership. Really, you moron? Really? These people, these Republicans, do they know just how freaking stupid they all sound? I don't think they do. I don't think they do. These are talking points circulated by Donald Trump or some people associated, maybe Roger Stone or some of them, who are just as wacky and nut-jobbish as most other Republicans. But if you're making that argument and you are a leader, you serve in the leadership of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives, and you say stupid, asinine shit like that, that is, to me, ridiculous. It is absolutely ridiculous. And anyone who votes for Steve Scalise to be in leadership or as their representative in Congress are just about stupid as Steve Scalise is. So, okay, so that's one argument. Congressman Scalise offers 3 other novel rationales to deny D.C. statehood. All of them rely on the supposition that his government is too incompetent to deserve statehood. D.C. budget is in a chronic deficit. The report that Steve Scalise cited in this particular diatribe was 17 years old when D.C. did have some financial woes, particularly during the Marion Barry years. So that's one thing he's citing. He's citing that they're incompetent. Actually, if you look at more recent data that D.C. has provided, the city actually amassed a huge budget surplus. It easily rode out the coronavirus pandemic all on their own. They didn't ask the federal government for funding. They didn't help, winter, they don't ask the federal government to help pay their winter plowing expenses or snow removal or any of that. They do it themselves because they can. Because they are financially able to. Most states wish they were that financially stable. Then he moves on to another asinine rationale that crime is up in D.C. But guess what, Mr. Scalise? Crime is up everywhere in America. Everywhere. Doesn't matter where you are, crime is up. Crime is well below, if you look at D.C. numbers, the current crime numbers are well below the 1990 numbers. In fact, if you want to even look even more and investigate even more, Scalise's home state of Louisiana is the most murderous state in the Union. Put that in your hat and smoke it, Mr. Scalise. Your state, the state of Louisiana, is the most murderous state in the Union. Under his rationale, we should give it back to France. Under the rationale, he says. Now, they shouldn't be part of the Union because their crime is too high. Well, give it back to France then. Give Louisiana back to France under that stupid asinine rationale. Statehood, like so many things in Washington, D.C., has become so politicized. When it comes to D.C., Republicans have suggested retroceding the district to Maryland, giving it back to Maryland, saying you came from Maryland, you're going to go back to Maryland. Maryland doesn't want it. Maryland wants them to be an independent state. They don't want them to be a part of them again. They want them to be independent. When it comes to Puerto Rico, saying that it would be, along with D.C., it would give Democrats an advantage. Former Arizona Senator Martha Sally, another whack job that can't get her own elected position, she has to be appointed because she's so damn dumb. She said that if Republicans go along with the Democrats, that Republicans would permanently lose the Senate, which is absurd. Republicans are claiming it would create another quote-unquote blue state. It's crazy. Puerto Rico has elected right-leaning governors, leaders in both their House and their Senate, and they also bring right-leaning representatives to the Congress. So I would argue that Puerto Rico would likely become a swing state. Present opportunities for Democrats and Republicans. Yes, D.C. will most likely be Democrat. Democrats would probably pick up, they already have a House seat in Delegate Norton Holmes, but they would also pick up 2 senators that are probably Democrat. So the focal point should be this, and I believe it sums it up, and it has to sum it up in some way, and people will change their mind and say, you know what, members of Congress, vote for statehood for both of these. Vote for statehood for Puerto Rico. Vote for statehood for Washington, D.C. All citizens of the United States should have the rights given to them in the United States Constitution, even if they reside in Puerto Rico or the District of Columbia. Now, Senator Mitch McConnell, Moscow Mitch as we like to call him, he loves that term of endearment, Moscow Mitch. How you doing, Moscow Mitch? I hope you're doing well. Decried the notion of granting statehood to Puerto Rico, saying if he's majority leader, we are not going to have two new states, and we're not going to pack the court, which are two very different things. Packing the court, there's arguments against packing the court. I'm not for packing the court. I am for granting statehood to at least one of the two. I'm still up in the air about Washington, D.C. I believe there's arguments on both sides of that. We'll get to that later on. But I think Puerto Rico needs it. They deserve it. Their people need help that only being a state can give them. One of the founding principles of our nation is that our government should govern with the consent of the governed. In other words, the people. The Constitution starts out with we the people. So D.C. needs help, but Puerto Rico needs even more help. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my feelings on both Puerto Rican statehood and Washington, D.C. to end our segment. Washington, D.C., a beautiful area. If you haven't been to D.C. or you haven't been there in a while, please get to it. It's beautiful. I know a lot of things aren't open yet, but it really is a place to go and think and love and enjoy. D.C. is one of my favorite places to go. I can go there in a day. It's an easy day trip for where I live, about 2 hours to get to D.C. D.C. has struggled, and they're doing a lot better. Financially, they're doing better than, as I said, as many other states are doing. Crime is much better in D.C. than many other places. Yes, the riot is what gave the wake-up call that, you know what? D.C. needs to be, the mayor needs to be able to call out her guard. But I'm still up in the air about whether I think D.C. should be a state. I'm not against it, and I'm not for it. I'm for it in ways of benefiting the people with being able to have their budget being controlled by the government of Washington, D.C., and not by the Congress that can't even handle their own fiscal issues. I want the mayor to have more jurisdiction over their territory, their state, their area, their city. If you look at representation, what's interesting about the House of Representatives and its rules is the House is not a continuous body. It is not like the Senate. The Senate is a continuous body because a third of the Senate is up every 2 years. The House has fixed terms. It is a new Congress, a new House every 2 years. So every 2 years they can elect a new speaker. They vote on new rules. They can amend their rules. You can, in your rules, make Washington, D.C. delegate a voting member of the House of Representatives. You don't need a statehood bill to give Eleanor Holmes Norton the vote on the House floor, meeting as a House. You can do that with Puerto Rico or Guam or American Samoa, U.S. Virgin Islands. You can make all of those delegates voting members of the House with a simple rule that you only need majority. So if you have 218 votes in the House of Representatives, which we do right now, You could, next Congress, if we had that same majority, put that in the rules to make the delegates of all U.S. territories in the District of Columbia voting members of the House of Representatives. So it just takes political will for that. So D.C. wouldn't need a state for voting representation. Now, if you're going to get the budget out of control of the House of Representatives and the Senate, if you're going to be able to set your own tax structure and your own spending structure and pass your own laws, then yes, you're going to need statehood. That you're going to need statehood. And I don't believe there's any real solution to that other than statehood. It's not like you can propose a separate budget or a separate bill to give that authority over to the mayor. The mayor should control her own National Guard. That maybe could be a bill. So I don't know if statehood is entirely the answer for D.C. But D.C. or statehood for Puerto Rico is the answer. It is the only solution for Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico needs help. They need help. They're crying out for help, not for paper towels. So I believe that if we have a statehood for Puerto Rico and give them a star, I mean, I think that's a silly argument that we'll give them everything but statehood and not give them a star. That's ludicrous. But if you give them a star, make them a state so that businesses will come in and invest. So they can get the disability funding that they need and deserve. So they can get money for their highway trust fund payments. So they can get expanded Medicaid and get expanded federal minimum wage. That would help the people of Puerto Rico so much. There are parts of Puerto Rico that 2 or 3 hurricanes later still are not rebuilt. And we are now approaching the summer months of hurricanes again. Why are we not crying out? Why are the lobbying individuals, the folks out there that work on K Street, why are they not lobbying for statehood more fervently than they are? We know the governor wants it. We know that a plurality of the people in Puerto Rico want it. Why is this being politicized just because of a filibuster rule? Do we need to reform the filibuster? That's a segment for another show. But if that means it gets Puerto Rico statehood, then absolutely we should. But maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we need to have a more thorough discussion like we're having here today, laying out the pros and the cons, and throwing the chips up in the air and letting them fall where they may. So yes, I believe Puerto Rico needs and they deserve statehood. I do not believe Washington, D.C. at this time really needs statehood. I'm not saying they shouldn't have it. But at this point, I think it's more important to give Puerto Rico statehood because they really need it now. D.C. is in good shape for right now. Let's get the National Guard out of control of the Congress, or out of control of the President and the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of the Army. Let's get that out of their control, and let's give the delegates of all the American territories in the District of Columbia voting rights on the floor of the House of Representatives. I think it's only fair, and I think we need to do it now. It is a principle so deeply held that one of the primary reasons our founders rebelled against the crown. Yet many of our citizens who serve in the armed forces of the United States pay their taxes, obey the rules and laws, and honor the flag of these United States are relegated to second-class status because of congressional inaction. Congressional inaction has so hampered the governing of this country. We need a Congress that is receptive to change. And we need a Congress that hears the people loud and hears them clearly. Those who do it by demonstration, not riots. People who write letters or send emails or make phone calls or go to their congressperson and lobby them. Congress is silent. and it is hurting Americans. Until leaders who control the calendars, until they take this seriously, we are a hurting country. We are a hurting country that needs to be heard and needs to be fixed. The question is, do we have the political will to do it? Do members have the will to vote for these two pieces of legislation to give equal representation to American citizens? Time will tell. Time will tell. We are continuing our series on the 50 most influential people. When we come back, we'll continue with that series. So stay with us. We'll be back on the other side. We are continuing our series on the 50 most influential people. Each week I choose one person from each state to talk about and what makes them influential or important people within our society. This week we will be going to Arkansas and we'll be talking about lawyer and author John Grisham. John Grisham was born February 8th, 1955 in Jonesboro, Arkansas. He is best known for many legal thrillers, The Firm, The Pelican Brief, The Broker, The Appeal, The Client, just to name a few. He started writing plots for his books during lunch breaks when he was a lawyer. It was just a hobby for him. He actually says that his manuscripts are larger than his books are. In his 2 decades of writing, he has sold over 250 million copies around the world. Initially, he wanted to be a professional baseball player, but changed when he began to focus on his education. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in accounting and then went to law school. After he graduated from law school, he practiced law for 10 years. He was elected and served in the Mississippi House of Representatives from 1983 to 1990 as a Democrat. His very first bestseller was The Firm. It was released in 1991, sold over 7 million copies, and it was turned into a movie with Tom Cruise and Gene Hackman. If you haven't seen The Firm, they've been replaying it a lot on Xfinity. I don't know if they have it on your cable, but I'm sure you can find it somewhere on DVD or on demand or somewhere. It is really an awesome movie. I'm not a huge Tom Cruise fan, but there's a few of his movies I like. That one is very good. I read the book, and the movie is pretty true to the book. His third novel, The Pelican Brief, was published in 1993. That became an international bestseller, and that became a movie starring Denzel Washington and Julia Roberts. I'll be very honest, I've never seen the movie. I've read the book, never saw the movie in its entirety. I've seen bits and pieces of it, but never really saw the movie. His fourth novel, The Client, was published in 1983. It became a movie starring Susan Sarandon. It also became a short-lived television series, I believe, as well. One of my favorite movies, along with The Firm and The Client. He is a recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award at the Galaxy British Book Awards. He is married and has 2 children. He is on the board of directors of the Innocence Project, which is a project involved in acquitting convicts who were unfairly sentenced on the basis of DNA tests. There is a John Grisham room in the Mississippi State University, which houses all the materials written by him. And he is an avid baseball fan, probably goes back to his childhood when he wanted to be a professional baseball player. And just a little bit of trivia for you, that apart from J.K. Rowling, who wrote the Harry Potter series, and Tom Clancy, who writes a lot of thrillers, John Grisham is the only other author to sell 2 million copies in his first printing. That's pretty remarkable. John Grisham is a great author. I've not read every one of his books, but I've read a lot of them and I've watched a lot of the movies. Just a phenomenal writer. He's a self-taught writer, which law school helps a great deal with writing. But he really, his plots are fantastic. And if you like law thrillers or you like law shows on television, like I do, you'll definitely love his books because it brings the law to life through all these complex plots and twists. And just when you think you have it figured out, bam, something happens. And it's a totally new book then for you because then you just can't wait to see how it ends. And I love books like that. I love how I think I have the plot figured out and I know who killed that person or whatever, and then you get to that part where you're ready for it to be revealed and they throw a twist in there and it makes you re-envision the entire book all over again, and it makes you want more at the end of it. So that is definitely how John Grisham writes. I've been an admirer of his for a long time. Let me know what you think of John Grisham. If there's a favorite book that you have or a favorite movie of his, let me know in the comments section, or let me know on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. Let me know because I'd love to chat about John Grisham. I think along with Stephen King, really two of my most favorite authors. Well, that's it for this week's episode of Pumpkins and Politics. Thank you for joining me. Make sure to check out my website, www.pumpkinsandpolitics.com. Follow, like, share, subscribe to all my social media platforms. Let all your friends and family know about me. And remember, you can find my podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcasts each Thursday morning. I want to take this opportunity to wish all moms a very happy Mother's Day. A special shout out to my mom. I love you and I thank you for all you do and have done for me and all the sacrifices you have made for me. We would not be anything without the support and unconditional love of our moms. Tell your mom you love them. Join me next week when we'll have a discussion on the new 2020 census numbers and how it will impact the makeup of Congress, among other things. We will continue our 50 most influential people, this time from the state of California. Until next week, I'm your host, Chad George, reminding you to get vaccinated and wear your mask because together we can make a better world. Thank you, everyone. Have a great week. I'll see you next week. Bye. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. I can't wait to see what your comments are. Don't forget to like this video. Don't forget to share this video, comment on this video, follow our YouTube page. And like I said, we'll be back every Monday with our podcast that was recorded the week before. And I'll be back with additional content throughout the week. I can't wait to see you next week. Have a good week, everybody. Stay safe. Don't forget, please go get vaccinated. Go to your local pharmacy and get vaccinated. That's all you have to do. It's so simple, everybody. Get vaccinated and wear your mask because we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. And I want to make sure all of you are safe and that we can have a great rest of 2021. Thank you, everybody. Have a great week. I'll see you next week. Bye.